Giant Cowboy was forced to marry an obese 19-year-old, but he had shocking plans with her. The town gathers under the blazing sun. A drunken father bargains his daughter like cattle, 19, trembling, mocked for her size. The judge calls for a marriage by debt. Chains of shame rattle. And across from her, a giant cowboy steps forward. The vows are spoken, but instead of turning away, he tips his hat and stuns the crowd. He has shocking plans for her. Not to discard her, not to hide her, but to take her home and call her wife. Yet their new life is no safe haven. The land they ride into is claimed by ranchers, shadowed by treaties, and hunted by railroad gunmen. Fire, blood, and betrayal wait in the dark. What began as a cruel spectacle may spark the fiercest fight for love, land, and dignity the West has ever seen. Will this unlikely marriage break under shame, or rise into a triumph no one dared believe? Before we begin, drop a hello in the comments. Share your corner of the world and how you're feeling today. It's a beautiful thing to witness how stories can connect us across oceans, languages, and lives. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across San Juan Crossing's dusty main street. Martha Jo Kinney's hands trembled as she pressed them against her cotton skirt, trying to steady herself. The crowd's cruel whispers and snickers felt like stones pelting her back. "Going once!" her father's drunken voice rang out. "Who'll take her debts and troubles?" He swayed on his feet, waving a wrinkled paper, the list of his gambling losses. Martha Jo's cheeks burned with shame as townspeople gathered closer, treating her public humiliation like entertainment. Judge Tanner cleared his throat nervously, his eyes darting between the angry creditors and the growing crowd. "Now see here, this isn't exactly proper procedure." "Judge, that money's owed fair and square." One of the creditors cut in. "If marriage by debt's the only way to settle it, then so be it." Martha Jo's vision blurred with tears as she was pushed onto the rough wooden platform outside the saloon. The boards creaked beneath her feet, and she wished the ground would open up and swallow her whole. She'd always known her father was a sorry excuse for a parent, but this, selling his own daughter to cover his gambling debts, this was beyond anything she'd imagined. A shadow fell across the platform. Martha Jo looked up to see Silas Boone stepping forward, his massive frame blocking out the sun. Weather-creased skin and calloused hands spoke of years of honest ranch work. Unlike the jeering crowd, his expression held no mockery, just a quiet gravity that made her catch her breath. "Reckon I'll take responsibility," Silas said, his voice low but carrying across the suddenly hushed gathering. Judge Tanner jumped at the chance to end this unseemly spectacle. "Right then, let's make this official." He fumbled with his book of law, pages rustling in the hot breeze. "Do you, Silas Boone?" "No!" Martha Jo's voice cracked as she finally found her courage. "You can't just... This isn't..." But her protests died as her father's hand clamped down hard on her shoulder. The vows were a blur. Martha Jo heard herself speaking words that felt like ashes in her mouth, saw Silas's solemn nod as he made his own promises. The crowd's attention began to wander once the spectacle was over, people drifting away to their evening routines. But then Silas did something unexpected. He lifted his hat and addressed the dispersing crowd in that same quiet voice that somehow commanded attention. "I aim to take this lady home," he announced, "not as obligation but as wife." The townsfolk froze. Martha Jo's head snapped up, certain she'd misheard. But Silas's weathered face was completely serious as he continued. "She'll have a proper home, proper respect, and anyone who's got something, contrary to say about it, can take it up with me direct." Coming from a man of Silas's intimidating size, the statement carried weight. The remaining snickers died away. Even her father took an unsteady step backward. As the sun sank toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Silas led Martha Jo to the boarding house. He paid for a room with clean sheets and even arranged for a hot meal to be sent up. Now Martha Jo sat in the small but tidy room, hands clasped in her lap, trying to make sense of this strange turn her life had taken. The lamplight cast soft shadows on the worn wallpaper. Outside, she could hear the usual evening sounds of San Juan crossing, bootsteps on wooden sidewalks, the clang of the dinner bell at the cafes down the street, horses nickering in their stables. But inside this room, time seemed suspended. She stole glances at Silas, who had taken up position in a straight-backed chair near the door, giving her plenty of space. His hat rested on his knee, and his eyes were fixed on the window, allowing her privacy with her thoughts. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence she'd expected. There was something almost peaceful about it. Could he have meant what he said? Martha Jo had spent her whole life being the subject of cruel jokes and false kindness that turned mean. She'd learned early not to trust sweet words or easy promises. But there had been something in Silas's tone, something in the steady way he looked at people, that made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, he was different. The town's mocking laughter still echoed in her memory, but it seemed somehow distant now, muffled by the quiet dignity of this room and the solid presence of the man who had claimed her as wife, not burden. Martha Jo took a deep breath, tasting the lingering warmth of the fading day, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt something that might have been hope. The sunrise painted the sky in delicate shades of pink and gold as Martha Jo stepped out of the boarding house. Her few belongings were bundled in a worn carpet bag, clutched tight against her chest like a shield. The morning air held a hint of autumn crispness, making her pull her thin shawl closer around her shoulders. Silas Boone stood waiting with 2 saddled horses and a small wagon. The sight of him in the early light made her breath catch. He seemed even larger than she remembered, his broad shoulders blocking the rising sun. But his movements were careful, deliberate, as he adjusted the horse's tackle. "Morning, ma'am," he said softly, touching the brim of his hat. The simple courtesy, so different from yesterday's jeers and cruel laughter, made her throat tight. Martha Jo approached the wagon hesitantly, her steps stirring small clouds of dust. The wooden seat looked high, and she felt her cheeks flush hot with embarrassment. Before she could struggle with the climb, Silas stepped forward. "May I help you up?" he asked, keeping a respectful distance until she gave a slight nod. His hands were strong but gentle as he helped her onto the wagon seat. No snickers, no rough handling, just steady support that made the awkward moment easier. Martha Jo settled herself, smoothing her skirts to hide her trembling hands. Silas mounted his horse with practiced ease, and they set out northward. The wagon wheels creaked along rutted tracks that stretched toward the horizon. San Juan Crossing slowly shrank behind them, its buildings growing smaller until they disappeared altogether, leaving only the vast prairie spreading out in all directions. The morning wore on in silence. Martha Jo watched the landscape roll past, tall grass rippling in the breeze, scattered wildflowers adding dots of yellow and purple to the sea of green. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry carrying clear and lonely across the empty miles. It wasn't until the sun had climbed high that Silas finally spoke. "Got some land up north," he said, his voice matching the steady clip-clop of the horse's hooves. "Been clearing it, building bit by bit." He paused, glancing at her with those steady eyes. "Aim to make you a proper home there, a place where no one can mock or harm you?" Martha Jo studied his weathered face, searching for any hint of mockery or deceit. She'd learned young to distrust kind words. They usually hid cruel intentions. But Silas's expression held nothing but simple honesty. Near midday, they came upon a creek cutting through the prairie. The water ran clear over smooth stones, cottonwood trees offering patches of shade along its banks. Silas reined in beside the water. "Best let the horses drink," he said, dismounting. He moved to help Martha Jo down, but didn't rush her. He simply stood ready, waiting while she gathered her courage and her skirts. The creek's gentle murmur filled the air as the horses drank their fill. Martha Jo sat on a sun-warmed rock, watching Silas check each animal with careful attention. His big hands moved with surprising gentleness as he adjusted their bridles, patted their flanks, spoke to them in low tones. They continued their journey through the afternoon. The wagon swayed and jolted, but Silas always slowed for the rougher patches, glancing over to make sure she was steady. Such small considerations, yet each one chipped away at the walls of fear and suspicion she'd built around her heart. As evening approached, Silas guided them toward a stand of cottonwoods. "Good place to make camp," he said, helping her down from the wagon. "Water's near, and these trees'll break the wind." Martha Jo stood uncertain while Silas unloaded supplies. She'd never camped out under the open sky before. The prairie stretched endless around them, making her feel small and exposed. "Could you manage some supper?" Silas asked, already gathering wood for a fire. "Got beans and coffee in the wagon." Cooking had always been one thing she could do well, but everything felt different out here. Her hands shook as she measured beans into the pot, conscious of Silas's presence even though he kept his distance, focused on building the fire. The flames caught and grew, pushing back the gathering darkness. Silas tended them with the same quiet patience he'd shown all day, adding small sticks until the fire burned steady and bright. The bean pot bubbled awkwardly over the flames, while Martha Jo tried to remember everything she knew about camp cooking. Stars began appearing overhead, countless points of light in the deepening blue. The prairie night was huge and lonesome, filled with small sounds, the pop of the fire, crickets chirping, the soft shuffling of the hobbled horses. "Always wanted peace," Silas said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "A quiet place. Good land. Someone to share it with." He looked at her across the flames. "Didn't plan on finding it this way, but sometimes the good Lord works in ways we don't expect." Martha Jo stirred the beans, letting his words sink in. They were simple words, spoken plain and true. No flowery promises, no grand declarations, just a quiet man's honest hope for a peaceful life. Later, lying on her bedroll with a borrowed blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, Martha Jo stared up at the star-filled sky. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and Silas's steady breathing came from his own bedroll on the other side of the embers, a respectable distance away. Everything had changed so completely in just 2 days. The humiliation of the forced marriage still stung, but it was gradually being overshadowed by something else, something she hardly dared name. Silas's gentle actions, his careful courtesy, his talk of building her a real home, could it be true? Or was this just another cruel joke that would turn bitter with time? The night wind whispered through the cottonwood leaves overhead. Martha Jo pulled the blanket closer, caught between her lifelong habit of distrust and a tiny, persistent spark of hope that refused to be extinguished. Sleep was long in coming as she lay there, listening to the lonely coyote songs echo across the prairie, wondering what tomorrow might bring. The afternoon sun hung low in the western sky as their wagon followed a winding trail between rocky outcrops. Martha Jo sat straighter, taking in the view as Silas guided them around a final bend. A valley opened before them, cradled by mountains whose peaks still held patches of snow despite the late summer heat. "There it is," Silas said quietly. "Home." A log cabin stood near a creek that tumbled down from the ridges, its clear water catching the sunlight like scattered diamonds. Tall pines crowded the slopes, their dark green needles swaying in the breeze. The cabin itself was rough-hewn but solid-looking, with a stone chimney rising from one end and a small covered porch across the front. As they drew closer, Martha Jo noticed something that made her heart skip. Wooden stakes driven into the ground at intervals along the creek bank, their tops marked with red cloth that fluttered like warning flags. Silas's expression grew serious as he followed her gaze. "Best you know straight off," he said in a low voice, reining the horses to a stop. "This land, it's disputed territory." Martha Jo's hands twisted in her skirts. "Disputed? Ranch outfit claims grazing rights through here." Silas gestured toward the distant mountains. "But the Ute people got an old treaty says this valley's theirs." He sighed, the sound heavy with worry. "Been peaceful so far, but trouble's certain to come." The lovely valley suddenly felt less welcoming. Martha Jo watched a pair of magpies swoop across the creek, their black and white feathers flashing. "Why here, then?" she asked softly. "Good water, rich soil." Silas's eyes scanned the valley with quiet pride. Thought maybe if a man put down roots proper, made an honest claim. He trailed off, then added, "Now with us being married, our joint claim might hold stronger. Law looks kindly on homesteading families." The weight of his words settled over Martha Jo like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about their forced marriage anymore. Their union could determine the fate of this contested land. Silas guided the wagon the rest of the way to the cabin. The door creaked as he helped Martha Jo inside. The single room was sparse but neat, with a stone fireplace, a rough-built table, and a narrow bed frame pushed against one wall. Afternoon light filtered through two small windows, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. "It ain't much," Silas said, almost apologetically. "Been meaning to add on. Make it proper." Martha Jo stood in the center of the room, overwhelmed by how quickly her life had changed. 3 days ago she'd been in San Juan Crossing, enduring whispers and sideways glances. Now she was miles from anywhere, married to a quiet giant of a man, standing in a cabin on disputed land. They began unpacking the wagon as the sun sank toward the mountains. Silas's possessions were few but telling. A well-worn Bible with a cracked leather cover, a dented tin coffee pot that had seen many campfires, a carefully folded map marked with pencil lines and notations. Martha Jo ran her fingers over the Bible's soft leather. "You read this much?" "Every night I can," Silas replied, stacking firewood beside the hearth. "Helps remind me there's purpose in everything, even when it don't make sense at first." The cabin grew dim as evening approached. Silas lit a lamp, its warm glow making the rough walls feel almost cozy. But Martha Jo couldn't shake the unease that had settled over her since seeing those boundary stakes. "What happens when they come?" she asked suddenly. "The ranchers or the Ute people?" Silas paused in his work, regarding her thoughtfully. "Don't aim to fight, if that's what you're asking. Rather talk things through, find a way that's fair." He stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. "But I won't be run off neither. This can be a good place, Martha Jo. A place where you won't have to carry shame no more." She blinked back unexpected tears at his words. "Why do you care about my shame?" "Because no one deserves to be treated like you were." Silas's eyes held hers steadily. "Here, you'll have a voice. Your thoughts, your choices. They'll matter same as mine." The creek's rushing song filled the silence that followed. Martha Jo thought about voices, how hers had been ignored and mocked for so long, how this quiet man offered her what no one else had: dignity. As night settled over the valley, Silas insisted on sleeping on a bedroll near the fireplace, leaving the narrow bed for Martha Jo. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the water's endless murmur beyond the cabin walls. The sound was both soothing and unsettling, beautiful music that others would fight to claim. Her last thoughts before sleep took her were of boundaries, not just the stakes along the creek, but the careful space Silas kept between them, the gentle barriers he built to make her feel safe. Perhaps here, in this disputed valley, she could finally find a place where she truly belonged. Morning crept through the cabin's rough-hewn walls, thin golden rays finding gaps between the logs. Martha Jo woke to unfamiliar sounds, a rooster's distant crow, the gentle lowing of cattle, and the ever-present song of the creek. She sat up slowly on the narrow bed, watching dust motes dance in the early light. Silas was already gone, though the cabin still held warmth from the banked fire. His bedroll lay neatly folded by the hearth. The iron cookstove stood like a challenge in the corner. Martha Jo had cooked plenty at her father's house, but this stove was different, older, temperamental. Still, a wife should make breakfast. The thought sent a flutter through her stomach. Wife. The word still felt strange. She stirred the fire back to life and found flour in Silas's supplies. Biscuits seemed a safe choice. But the stove's heat was unpredictable, and the smell of scorching soon filled the cabin. Martha Joe's eyes stung with frustrated tears as she scraped blackened lumps from the pan. The cabin door creaked open. Silas ducked his tall frame through, bringing the scent of morning air and horse sweat with him. He paused, taking in the scene. Martha Joe, near tears, burnt biscuits smoking on the table. "Reckon that stove takes some getting used to," he said mildly. He picked up a blackened biscuit, bit into it, and chewed thoughtfully. "Still better than my cooking." Martha Joe stared at him. "You don't have to eat those." "Ain't so bad." He finished the biscuit. "Bottom ain't burnt at all." His simple kindness loosened something in her chest. She managed a small smile. "I'll do better tomorrow." "We got chores waiting," Silas said, brushing crumbs from his shirt. "Could use your help if you're willing." Outside, the valley glowed in morning light. They started with the water barrel, empty now from yesterday's use. Silas showed Martha Joe how to secure the barrel in the small wagon, then led the way to the creek. The water ran clear and cold, fresh from the mountain snow. "Best to gather water early," Silas explained, helping her dip the bucket. "Creek's cleanest then, before cattle come to drink upstream." Martha Joe found herself studying his hands, big and weathered, yet careful in their movements. They worked together quietly, finding a rhythm between bucket and barrel. Later, they moved on to fence mending. A rail had come loose near the corral, and Silas showed her how to hold the posts steady while he hammered. The simple physical work felt good, purposeful. "Never thought I'd have help with this," Silas said as they finished the repair. Something in his tone made Martha Joe look up. "Didn't you ever plan to marry?" she asked carefully. Silas was silent for a long moment, squinting at the distant mountains. "Didn't figure anyone would want to." He adjusted his hat brim. "Grew up an orphan, you see. Passed around different ranches, wherever they needed extra hands. Learn quick not to expect much permanent." Martha Joe absorbed this, thinking of her own father's neglect. "But you built this place," she said. "Made something permanent." "Tried to." His voice held a touch of pride. "Though I never aimed to have a wife forced into it." He glanced at her, his expression troubled. "That ain't right, what they did to you." "No," Martha Joe agreed softly. "But maybe," she hesitated, "maybe Providence has its own plans sometimes." Silas nodded slowly. "Been thinking that myself." They moved on to checking livestock, a small herd of cattle and 2 milk cows. Silas taught her each animal's habits and needs. Martha Joe found she liked the gentle-eyed cows, their warm breath and patient ways. The sun climbed higher as they worked. Martha Joe was surprised to find conversation coming easier between them. Silas spoke more than she'd yet heard him, explaining the ranch's rhythms and routines. She found herself sharing, too, stories of cooking for her sister, dreams of having her own garden someday. It was while riding the fence line that they spotted them, dark figures on horseback, silhouetted against the western ridge. Silas stiffened in his saddle. "Ranch hands," he said quietly. "Scouting the creek again?" He turned his horse toward home. "Best we head back now." Martha Joe felt the tension in his words. The riders were too far to make out faces, but their presence cast a shadow over the bright day. They rode swiftly back to the cabin, Silas's eyes scanning the ridgeline often. Evening settled over the valley like a soft blanket. While Silas worked by lamplight, methodically mending a torn piece of tack, Martha Joe found paper and pencil. She needed to write to her sister Sarah, still living in their father's house in San Juan Crossing. The letter came slowly at first, then faster as words found their way. "Dearest Sarah, so much has changed in 3 days. I know you must be worried, hearing how I was married. But Sarah, this place, It's beautiful in ways I never expected. The mountains touch the sky, and the creek sings all day and night. Silas is not what people said. He is quiet but kind. He eats burnt biscuits without complaint and teaches me ranch work as if I've always belonged here. She wrote about the cabin, the animals, the valley itself. She didn't mention the boundary stakes or the watching riders. No need to worry Sarah more. The letter would take weeks to reach town anyway, carried by whatever rider happened to be heading that direction. Martha Jo looked up from her writing to find Silas watching her, his hands still on the leather he was mending. Something passed between them in that quiet moment. Understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of trust. He returned to his work, and she to her letter. The lamp flame danced, casting their shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, the creek murmured its endless song. Martha Jo felt something shifting inside her, like earth after rain. This marriage had started as a debt, a punishment. But here in this contested valley, watching Silas's careful hands work by lamplight, she began to sense it could become something real. 2 days passed like water in the creek, each hour bringing new rhythms to Martha Jo's life on the homestead. The morning sun had just cleared the eastern ridge when 3 sharp knocks echoed through the cabin. Martha Jo froze at the sound, her hands deep in bread dough. Silas was out checking cattle. She wiped her fingers on her apron and moved cautiously to the door, heart quickening at this unexpected visitor. When she opened it, a tall figure stood on the threshold, blocking the morning light. He wore buckskin leggings and a cotton shirt, a bow held loosely in one hand. His black hair was tied back with a leather strip, and his dark eyes studied her with careful assessment. "I am Henry," he said in clear English. "I come to speak of the creek valley." Martha Jo's fingers tightened on the doorframe, but something in his peaceful stance calmed her initial fear. She thought of the boundary stakes Silas had shown her, of the watching riders on the ridge. Would you like some coffee?" The words surprised her even as she spoke them. Henry's eyebrows lifted slightly. He glanced past her into the cabin, then back to her face, weighing something in his mind. "Yes," he said finally. "Coffee would be welcome." Martha Jo stepped back, letting him enter. Her hands trembled slightly as she moved to the stove, where coffee already simmered. She could feel Henry's eyes taking in the cabin's sparse furnishings. The rough table, the iron stove, the neatly made bed in the corner. "Please sit," she offered, gesturing to one of the wooden chairs. Henry settled himself carefully, laying his bow across his knees. She poured coffee into 2 tin cups and placed one before him. "The water that feeds your creek," Henry began, his voice measured. "It comes from springs sacred to my people. Many promises were made about this valley." He wrapped his hands around the warm cup, but didn't drink. "All were broken." Martha Jo sat across from him, her own coffee untouched. "I didn't know about the promises," she said softly. "Few do, or few care to remember." Henry's eyes met hers. "Now railroad men circle like coyotes. Ranchers push their cattle up the creek. The water grows less each season." The cabin door creaked open. Silas filled the doorway, his expression cautious but not hostile. He nodded to Henry. "Thought I saw tracks leading this way." "Your wife offered coffee," Henry explained, inclining his head slightly. "She's got a good heart." Silas moved to stand behind Martha Jo's chair, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "We mean no harm to your people, Henry. This land was empty when I came." "Empty because others were driven out." Henry's tone held old pain, but no anger. "But you are not like them. You build slow, take only what you need." He finally lifted his coffee cup, sipping thoughtfully. "Perhaps there is room for understanding." Martha Jo found her voice. "The water should be shared," she said. "There's plenty if people don't get greedy." Henry studied her with new interest. "You speak truth without fear. This is rare." He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew a bundle wrapped in cloth. "A gift, for your welcome." He placed it on the table, dried venison, dark and rich smelling. "Much obliged," Silas said quietly. Henry rose, gathering his bow. At the door he paused, looking back at Martha Jo. "Your heart is bigger than their cruel words in town," he said. "Remember that." After he left, Martha Jo sat very still, aware of Silas's hand still warm on her shoulder. "I was scared," she admitted, "but it didn't seem right to turn him away." "Takes courage to be kind." Silas pulled out the chair Henry had vacated and sat heavily. "Most folks wouldn't have offered coffee to a Ute scout." Martha Jo traced the rim of her cup with one finger. "I used to dream of being a teacher," she said softly. "Thought maybe I could help children see past the things that divide people." She gave a bitter little laugh. "But everyone said I was too big, too awkward, said no one would want their children taught by someone who looked like me." Silas was quiet for a long moment, watching her face. Folks can be cruel when they're scared of what's different. He reached across the table and touched her hand. But sometimes the very things they mock become strength. The day settled into evening, crickets beginning their nightly chorus beyond the cabin walls. Martha Jo finished her bread making while Silas cleaned his rifle by lamplight. The visit from Henry seemed to hang in the air between them, full of meaning neither had fully grasped yet. "Been thinking," Silas said finally, his deep voice gentle in the lamplit quiet. "Maybe this marriage of ours, maybe it's meant for more than just mending our own hurts." Martha Jo looked up from her work, flour dusting her arms. "What do you mean?" "Way you treated Henry today. With respect, like a person worth knowing." Silas carefully set his rifle aside. "Made me wonder if we might do some good here. Help heal more than just our reputations. Maybe even help mend some of the breaks between peoples." Martha Jo felt the weight of his words settle over her like a blanket, heavy but somehow comforting. Could she rise to such a calling? She who had been mocked and shamed, married off to pay a debt, could she become someone who built bridges instead of walls? The crickets sang their endless song outside. The creek whispered its secrets. And in the warm lamplight of their small cabin, Martha Jo felt something unfamiliar stirring in her heart. Not quite hope, not quite courage, but something growing toward both. The week unfolded like pages in a fresh journal, each day bringing new lessons for Martha Jo to master. Morning light found her at the iron stove, flour dusting her arms as she worked the dough with growing confidence. The burns and failures of her first attempts gave way to golden brown loaves that filled the cabin with their warm, yeasty scent. "Reckon you've got the touch now," Silas said, slicing into a fresh loaf one morning. Steam rose from the tender crumb, and his appreciative nod made her cheeks warm with pride. In the barn, Martha Jo learned the rhythm of morning milking. Her fingers were clumsy at first, but the patient cow stood quietly as she found her way. Soon the tin pail rang with steady streams of warm milk. The hens, too, became her charges. She gathered eggs with careful hands, talking softly to the pecking birds as she scattered feed. "Never thought I'd take to ranch work," she admitted to Silas one morning, watching the chickens scratch in the dirt. "Pa always said I was too clumsy for anything useful." Silas's weathered face darkened at that. "Your pa was wrong about a lot of things." On Wednesday, Silas led a stout bay mare from the corral. "Time you learned to ride proper," he said, adjusting the stirrups. "Can't have my wife walking everywhere." Martha Jo eyed the horse's broad back nervously. "I don't know, Silas. What if I fall? Then you'll get back up." He offered his cupped hands as a step. "I won't let any harm come to you." She gathered her skirts and put her foot in his hands, letting him boost her up. The mare shifted, and Martha Jo grabbed the saddle horn with a startled laugh that echoed across the valley. Silas's strong hand steadied her leg. "There now," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Just sit tall and breathe easy." By Saturday, Martha Jo felt steady enough to ride into San Juan Crossing. They set out early, the morning air crisp with autumn's approach. Silas rode beside her, occasionally calling out gentle reminders about her posture or the reins. The town's main street was busy when they arrived. Martha Jo felt the familiar tightness in her chest as heads turned their way. Whispers followed them like shadows as they tied their horses outside the mercantile. "Look who's back, the gambling debt bride." Poor Silas, saddled with that one. Heard tell she can't even cook proper. Silas's hand settled protectively at the small of her back as they climbed the wooden steps. The touch was gentle, but firm, a silent statement to all who watched. She was his wife, and he would brook no disrespect. Inside the store, Martha Jo kept her eyes down, focusing on their list. Sugar, coffee, lamp oil, thread. She could feel the stares of other customers, hear their whispered comments. Silas stayed close, his tall frame like a shield between her and their cruel words. When the storekeeper's wife sniffed disapprovingly at Martha Jo's selection of fabric, Silas spoke up. "My wife has fine taste," he said, his quiet voice carrying clearly. "We'll take the blue calico and the white muslin too." Outside they paused at the churchyard, where Reverend Colby was tending the small garden. The preacher straightened up, wiping his brow as he approached them with a genuine smile. "Martha Jo, Silas," he called warmly. "Good to see you both. The Lord's been laying it on my heart to ride out your way soon. Thought we might hold a service at your cabin next Sunday, if you're willing." Martha Jo felt Silas glance at her, leaving the choice to her. "We'd be honored, Reverend," she said softly. "Wonderful." Reverend Colby beamed. "A house isn't truly a home until prayers have been offered under its roof." As they spoke with the preacher, a group of men in dark suits passed by. Railroad agents, their faces set in hard lines. They stared coldly at Silas and Martha Jo, their disapproval plain. Martha Jo recognized one as Agent Whitmore, who'd been asking questions about water rights in the valley. The ride home was slower, the wagon loaded with supplies. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the trail as their horses plodded steadily northward. Martha Jo's thoughts turned over and over like leaves in the wind. "Will it always be like this?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The stares, the whispers? Will they mock me forever?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, just the creak of leather and the steady clip of hooves filling the air. When he spoke, his words were measured and clear. "What matters isn't what they see," he said firmly. "It's what we build. Every day you prove them wrong, with your kindness, your strength, your willing heart. They can whisper all they want, but they can't touch what's growing between us." Martha Jo felt tears prick at her eyes, but they weren't tears of shame this time. Something stronger welled up inside her, something like hope. The sun was setting when they finally reached the cabin, painting the valley in shades of gold and purple. Silas helped her down from her horse, his hands steady and sure. Together they unloaded the wagon, their movements falling into an easy rhythm they'd developed over the past week. When darkness settled fully, Martha Jo lit the lanterns. Their warm glow spilled from the cabin windows, reaching out into the gathering night. She stood in the doorway, watching Silas lead the horses to the barn for their evening feed. The creek sang its endless song, and a cool breeze carried the scent of sage. For the first time since that horrible morning on the street in San Juan Crossing, Martha Jo felt something settle deep in her soul. This small cabin, this patch of disputed earth, this quiet man who defended her without hesitation. It wasn't the life she'd dreamed of as a girl. But standing there in the lantern light, she realized it might be something better. This place, against all odds, was becoming home. Sunday morning dawned with golden light spilling over the eastern ridge. Martha Jo stood at the cabin window, watching frost melt from the grass like scattered sugar. Her hands smoothed her best dress, the blue calico they had bought in town. The fabric still held creases from being folded, but she had pressed it carefully the night before. Inside the cabin, savory scents filled the air. A large pot of venison stew simmered on the stove, seasoned with dried herbs she had gathered. Golden cornbread cooled on the sideboard. Martha Jo had risen before first light to begin the preparations, wanting everything to be perfect for their first gathering. "Smells mighty fine," Silas said, coming in from feeding the stock. His Sunday shirt was crisp, his boots freshly polished. He paused beside her at the window, and Martha Jo felt the familiar warmth of his presence. The first guests arrived as morning dew still clung to the grass. Henry led his family down from the northern hills, his wife wrapped in a bright blanket, 3 children walking proudly beside their parents. Martha Jo hurried out to greet them, her heart beating fast with nervousness. "Welcome," she said, gesturing toward the cabin. "Please, come in where it's warm." Henry's wife, standing fawn, smiled and pressed Martha Jo's hand. The children peered shyly around their mother's skirts. The youngest girl offered Martha Jo a small deerskin pouch filled with dried berries. More wagons and riders appeared along the valley road. Reverend Colby arrived on his dappled mare, his Bible tucked safely in his saddlebag. Several families from outlying homesteads followed, including some who had witnessed Martha Jo's shame that day in town. She lifted her chin and greeted them all with quiet dignity. Silas had arranged rough benches beneath the cottonwoods, where golden leaves drifted down like blessing. A broad tree stump served as Reverend Colby's pulpit. The morning air held just enough chill to make everyone draw close. The service began with a hymn. Martha Jo was surprised to hear Silas's deep voice join in beside her, rich and sure on the familiar words. His arm brushed against hers as they shared the hymnal, and she felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with nervousness. Reverend Colby's sermon spoke of bridges, between people, between cultures, between hearts. His words seemed to float on the morning breeze, touching each person gathered there. Martha Jo watched faces soften as he spoke of God's love reaching across all divisions. "Look around you," the preacher said, gesturing to their mixed gathering. "This is what the Lord intends, his children breaking bread together in peace." After the final prayer, Martha Jo served the meal she had prepared. Bowls of steaming stew passed from hand to hand. Children who had once pointed and laughed at her in town now asked shyly for seconds of her cornbread. She saw their parents' surprised looks as they tasted her cooking. Standing fawn showed Martha Jo how to wrap the cornbread in grape leaves to keep it moist. Other women gathered around, sharing their own cooking secrets. Laughter rose easily, bridging old barriers. Martha Jo felt tears prick her eyes as Mrs. Turner, who had turned away from her in the mercantile just days ago, asked earnestly for her stew recipe. The afternoon stretched long and golden. Children played together in the grass, while adults talked quietly in small groups. Henry and Silas spoke at length about the creek's water levels, their conversation marked by mutual respect. Even the most hardened ranchers seemed to soften in the gentle autumn air. As shadows lengthened, someone called for another hymn. Silas's voice rose clear and strong, and Martha Jo found herself harmonizing naturally with him. Their voices twined together like the creek's braided channels, and she saw several people exchange knowing smiles. "Never heard you sing before," she whispered when the song ended. "Never had reason to," he answered softly, his eyes holding hers. Dusk settled over the valley like a prayer shawl. Fireflies rose from the grass, their lights dancing between the cottonwoods. Most guests had departed, leaving just a few lingering around the dying cook fire. Martha Jo sat beside Silas on a log, tired but content. "You did well today," he said quietly. "Real well." She looked up at him, reading the pride in his weathered face. The firelight softened his features, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Martha Jo," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you're the answer to prayers I never dared voice. I asked the Lord for peace in my valley. Instead, he sent me you, and you brought both peace and purpose." Her heart swelled so full she could hardly speak. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen, truly valued. Not for her cooking or her work, but for herself. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she reached for his hand. The moment held, precious as spun glass. Then, from somewhere beyond the northern ridge, came the faint sound of hoofbeats, multiple riders moving in the darkness where no neighbor should be. Martha Jo felt Silas stiffen beside her, his hand tightening on hers. The peace they had built that day suddenly felt fragile as frost. Like the morning's ice crystals, it could vanish with a touch of heat. She watched shadows move against the starlit ridge, and unease crept back into her heart like a chill wind. But that was a worry for tomorrow. For now she held fast to the memory of this blessed day, of breaking bread with former enemies, of children's laughter, of Silas's song rising with hers toward heaven. Whatever shadows gathered on their horizon, they would face them together. Dawn crept over the valley with a strange heaviness in the air. Silas stepped out of the cabin, boots crunching on frost-covered grass. He headed toward the barn for morning chores, then stopped abruptly. Fresh boot prints marked the earth near the barn door, prints too deep to be from yesterday's visitors. Martha Jo appeared in the cabin doorway, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. "What is it?" "Railroad men," Silas muttered, crouching to study the tracks. "Been prowling around in the night." His weathered face tightened with worry as he traced the outline of a boot heel with his finger. Inside the barn, nothing seemed disturbed, but Silas checked every corner. His movements were sharp, alert. He gathered his tools and began sharpening them with purposeful strokes, the rasp of steel against whetstone echoing through the morning quiet. Martha Jo tried to focus on her chores. She scattered feed for the chickens, her hands trembling slightly as she watched Silas check and reload his rifle. The weight of unseen eyes seemed to press upon them from the ridgelines. "Lord, keep us safe," she whispered, herding the sheep into their pen. "Guard this valley and those who dwell here." Her prayers continued as she worked, a constant stream of whispered words rising like smoke. The day stretched long and tense. Silas patrolled the boundaries of their land, rifle ready. Martha Jo's heart jumped at every sudden sound, a branch breaking, a horse whinnying, the wind gusting through cottonwoods. Even the creek's familiar burble seemed somehow ominous. As evening approached, Martha Jo stirred a pot of beans on the stove, trying to keep her hands steady. Silas sat by the window, cleaning his rifle for the third time. The sun had just dipped behind the western ridge when the first shot cracked through the twilight. "Get down!" Silas shouted, surging to his feet. More shots followed, splintering the cabin's window frame. Through the broken glass, Martha Jo saw flames leap up against the darkening sky. The barn! Orange light bloomed as fire caught the dry wood. Her heart nearly stopped as she heard the terrified cries of trapped animals. Silas burst through the cabin door, rifle raised, muzzle flashes sparked from the shadows near the creek. A bullet whined past him as he returned fire. Martha Jo scrambled for water buckets, her skirts trailing in the dirt. "The horses!" she screamed. Smoke billowed black against the purple dusk. She ran toward the barn, choking on the acrid fumes. Tears streamed down her face as she heaved water at the spreading flames. Another shot rang out. Silas grunted and staggered, his left shoulder jerking backward. Blood darkened his shirt, but he kept firing, driving the attackers back from the creek. Livestock broke free from the burning barn, horses galloping wild-eyed into the night, sheep bleating in panic as they scattered across the valley. The heat seared Martha Jo's face as she fought the fire, bucket after bucket, her arms aching and lungs burning. The gunmen's shots grew more distant. Then silence fell, broken only by the roar of flames and pop of burning timber. The attackers had vanished like smoke, leaving destruction in their wake. "Silas!" Martha Jo turned to see him swaying on the porch, rifle slipping from his grasp. Blood soaked his left side, dark against the white shirt. He took 2 stumbling steps toward her before his knees buckled. She reached him just as he collapsed, easing him down onto the rough boards. "Oh God, oh God!" she sobbed, tearing strips from her petticoat to press against the wound. Blood welled between her fingers. Inside, Silas gasped. Get me inside. Somehow she helped him through the cabin door. He was massive against her, his weight nearly dragging them both down. She managed to lay him on their bed, her hands shaking as she cut away his shirt. The bullet had struck his shoulder, leaving an ugly wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. Martha Jo worked frantically, cleaning it as best she could with whiskey from Silas's medicine chest. Her prayers tumbled out between sobs as she packed the wound with clean cloth. Stay with me, she pleaded, watching fever flush his face. Please, Silas, stay with me. Through the window, she could see the barn's skeleton black against the night sky, still smoldering. The air reeked of smoke and blood. Their peaceful homestead, so full of hope just yesterday, lay broken in the darkness. Silas groaned, his skin burning hot beneath her touch. She bathed his face with cool water, watching helplessly as fever took hold. All her dreams of their shared future seemed to crumble like the barn's charred timbers. Hour after hour, Martha Jo tended him. She whispered prayers until her voice grew hoarse, begging God to spare him. But beneath her prayers lay a harder truth. The valley's enemies would not stop. This attack was only the beginning. As midnight passed, Martha Jo sat beside their bed, holding Silas's fevered hand. Her tears had run dry, leaving something else in their place, a steel-hard certainty. She would not let them be driven out. She would not watch this man, who had given her dignity and purpose, be destroyed. Somehow she would find a way to fight back. Grey dawn light filtered through smoke that still curled from the blackened ruins of the barn. Martha Jo hadn't slept, her eyes gritty from watching over Silas through the long night. Her back ached from sitting in the straight-backed chair beside their bed, but she couldn't rest. Not yet. In the cabin's small kitchen, she crushed willow bark with trembling hands, preparing tea for Silas's fever. The kettle whistled softly on the iron stove. Outside, a rooster crowed. At least some of their animals had survived. Here, she murmured, lifting Silas's head to help him drink. His skin burned beneath her touch, but his eyes were clearer than they'd been hours ago. He managed a few sips before sinking back against the pillows. Martha Jo forced herself to eat a piece of bread, knowing she needed strength. Then she stepped out into the cool morning air, determined to salvage what she could. The barn's skeleton loomed before her, still smoking in places. The acrid smell made her eyes water, or maybe those were tears she refused to let fall. One by one, she gathered scattered hens, coaxing them with handfuls of feed. She found dropped tools and scattered tack, collecting each piece like precious gold. Their life wouldn't end in ashes. She wouldn't allow it. Hoofbeats approached from the creek trail. Martha Jo's heart jumped until she recognized the rider, Henry, the Ute scout. His face was grim as he dismounted. "I saw smoke," he said, scanning the destruction. "Railroad men." Martha Jo nodded, her throat tight. "They came at dusk, shot Silas, burned everything they could." Henry's dark eyes narrowed. "They move fast now. Without proof of your claim, they will take the valley within days." He touched the charred barn door. "The agent, Whitmore, he has papers ready. False papers." Inside the cabin, Silas stirred at their voices. "Martha," he called weakly. She hurried to his side, Henry following. Silas's face was pale beneath his beard, but his gaze was steady. "Come closer," he whispered. When she leaned in, his words were faint but urgent. "Papers, filed them 3 weeks back, at the agency office in Miller's Fork." "What papers?" Martha Jo asked. "Put the land in your name, not mine." He drew a shaky breath. "Knew they'd come for me first. But a woman's claim, they won't expect that." Martha Jo's hands trembled. "You did that? For me? For us?" His fingers found hers. "You need to ride. Get those papers before Whitmore discovers them." Fear clutched at her throat. Miller's Fork was 2 days' hard ride through rough country. She'd never traveled so far alone. "I'll guide you part way," Henry offered. Know the safe trails. Martha Jo looked at the ruin outside, then at Silas's pale face. What choice did she have? Their future lay in those documents. Yes, she said softly. I'll go. She spent the next hours preparing, moving with desperate purpose. She saddled the blue roan mare, their gentlest horse, thankfully spared from the fire. Into her saddlebags went hard biscuits, jerky, and a canteen. She wrapped Silas's pistol in an old shirt and tucked it deep in the bag. Henry helped her gather medicinal herbs for Silas's wound. She wrote careful instructions for Reverend Colby's wife, who agreed to tend him while Martha Jo was gone. The good woman arrived by wagon near sunset, bringing fresh bandages and broth. As night fell, Martha Jo knelt beside Silas's bedroll. Lamplight cast warm shadows across his face. His hand found hers, squeezing faintly. I'll return, she promised, with those papers safe. No, you will. His voice was weak but certain. You're stronger than anyone knows. She bent to kiss his forehead, then tucked the blanket around him. The fever still burned, but not as fierce as before. She had to believe he would heal. Martha Jo checked her preparations one final time. The mare was ready, saddlebags packed. Henry would meet her at first light. She'd never imagined riding out alone into danger, but then she'd never imagined any of this life that now felt so precious. By lamplight, she studied her reflection in the cabin's small mirror. The frightened girl from San Juan Crossing was gone. In her place stood a woman with purpose in her eyes, ready to fight for what was hers. Dawn would come soon, and with it, her chance to save everything they'd built together. The sun crept over the eastern ridge, painting the smoke-stained valley in shades of rose and gold. Martha Jo stood beside the blue roan mare, checking the cinch one final time. Her hands shook as she adjusted the saddlebags, but she forced them steady. Too much depended on this ride. Henry sat astride his pony nearby, dark eyes scanning the trail south. We should move now, he said quietly. While morning is cool? Martha Jo glanced back at the cabin where Mrs. Colby was tending to Silas. The minister's wife stood in the doorway, her grey shawl pulled tight against the dawn chill. God be with you, child, Mrs. Colby called softly. Taking a deep breath, Martha Jo gripped the saddle horn and swung up onto the mare. The horse shifted beneath her, sensing her tension. She gathered the reins, remembering Silas's patient lessons. Sit deep. Stay balanced. Trust your mount. Henry led the way down the creek trail, setting an easy pace. Dust rose from their horses' hooves, hanging in the still morning air. Martha Jo focused on following his lead, trying to quiet the fear that fluttered in her chest. She'd never ridden further than San Juan Crossing before. The morning wore on as they followed the winding trail south. The sun climbed higher, baking the rocky ground. Scrub cedar gave way to open range dotted with sage. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing the silence. Near midday, they paused at a shallow creek to water the horses. Martha Jo's legs trembled as she dismounted. She'd never ridden so long at one stretch. Here, Henry offered her his canteen. You must drink too. She took it gratefully, sipping the warm water. Her hands shook slightly as she passed it back. Henry studied her face. You are afraid, he said. It wasn't a question. Martha Jo nodded, too tired to pretend otherwise. I've never done anything like this before. Yet you ride anyway. Henry's expression softened. That is courage, not the absence of fear, but moving forward despite it. The horses grazed nearby, pulling at the sparse grass. Martha Jo stretched her aching muscles. What if I fail? She whispered. What if I can't find the papers or they're already destroyed? Then you will have tried. Henry's voice was firm. That matters more than you know. My people have a saying, a warrior's first victory is over her own doubt. They mounted up again, riding through the heat of afternoon. The landscape changed gradually, more rocks, fewer trees. By evening, they reached a fork in the trail. One branch led southeast toward the agency post, the other wound west into Ute territory. Henry reined his pony to a stop. "I must leave you here," he said. "Soldiers at the agency?" He shook his head. "They do not trust my kind." Martha Jo felt her throat tighten. She'd grown used to his quiet presence beside her. "Thank you," she managed, "for everything." He nodded once. "Remember, you have more strength than you know." Then he turned his pony west, soon disappearing among the rocks. Martha Jo pressed on alone, following the southeast trail until dusk made further travel dangerous. She found a sheltered spot near the road, beneath an old cottonwood. After unsaddling the mare, she spread her bedroll and tried to eat some jerky, though her stomach was too knotted for much food. Night settled over the land like a dark blanket. Stars wheeled overhead, brilliant and distant. Martha Jo clutched the satchel of papers close, using it as a pillow. Coyotes began their nightly chorus, their eerie songs echoing across the empty land. She shivered, missing the safety of the cabin, the warmth of Silas beside her. Sleep came in fitful patches. Every sound made her start: an owl's wing, a rabbit in the brush, the mare shifting on her picket line. Yet somehow the night passed, and dawn painted the eastern sky once more. Martha Jo rose stiffly, her muscles protesting. She forced down breakfast, half a biscuit and some dried apple, then saddled the mare with trembling fingers. Each mile that followed made her heart pound harder. What dangers waited at the agency? Would Whitmore's men be there already? The sun climbed high and hot as she rode. Dust coated her throat. The mare's steady hoofbeats marked time like a drum. Just when Martha Jo thought she couldn't bear another hour in the saddle, she topped her eyes and saw them. The low buildings of the agency post, smoke curling from stone chimneys. She drew the mare to a halt, studying the scene below. A handful of structures hunched against the landscape. The agent's house, a storehouse, the clerk's office. A few horses stood tied at a rail. Her fingers clutched the reins tighter. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered. Then she straightened her spine and urged the mare forward. The beast's hooves clattered on the packed earth of the agency yard. A clerk looked up from his chair on the office porch, squinting at her approach. Martha Jo dismounted before the steps, her legs wobbly but her chin high. The satchel of papers felt like lead in her hands, but she gripped it firmly. She was no longer the shy, shamed girl from San Juan Crossing. She was Silas Boone's wife, here to claim what was rightfully theirs. Taking a deep breath, she climbed the weathered steps toward the clerk's office door. The agency office smelled of dust and old paper. Martha Jo's heart hammered as she stepped inside, clutching the precious satchel. Behind a wooden desk sat Mr. Anders, the clerk, his spectacles perched low on his nose as he studied her with weary eyes. "Yes?" he asked, barely looking up from his ledger. Martha Jo swallowed hard. "Sir, I'm Martha Jo Boone. I've come about our valley claim." That made him pause. He set down his pen, studying her more carefully now. "Boone? The disputed creek property north of San Juan Crossing?" "Yes, sir." Her fingers trembled as she opened the satchel, drawing out the folded papers Silas had entrusted to her. "My husband, Silas Boone, filed these documents 3 weeks ago. A joint marriage claim, granting me rights as lawful heir." Anders took the papers with a frown, unfolding them carefully. His eyes scanned the contents, brow furrowed. "This is unusual. A forced marriage settlement turned legitimate claim." He glanced up sharply. "How do I know these weren't obtained under duress?" "Sir, Martha Jo started, but the office door banged open behind her. "Well now, what have we here?" The voice sent ice through her veins. Railroad Agent Whitmore strode in, his boots clicking on the wooden floor. A folded document protruded from his vest pocket. "Miss Kinney," he said smoothly, emphasizing her maiden name. "Such a long ride from town. And all for nothing, I'm afraid." He pulled out his own papers, spreading them on Anders' desk with a flourish. You see, I have here documentation proving that marriage completely invalid. Her father's debts void any claim she might make. The land returns to public domain, and the railroad's right of way." Martha Joe's hands clenched into fists. "That's not true," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I was there. Everyone saw." "A public spectacle, nothing more," Whitmore sneered. "No legal standing." "Mr. Anders." Martha Joe turned to the clerk, willing her voice not to shake. "I can recount every detail of that day. Judge Tanner presided, Reverend Colby witnessed. The whole town gathered outside the saloon at 9 o'clock in the morning. My father had lost $500 at cards. He couldn't pay, so he offered me instead." She drew a steadying breath. Silas stepped forward when called. He spoke the vows clear and true, though none expected it. Then he took me to the boarding house, treated me with respect. The next day, we rode north together to start our life. Anders studied her face. "That's quite specific. Send a telegram to Reverend Colby," she pressed. "He'll confirm every word. Judge Tanner, too. They know the truth." The clerk hesitated, glancing between her earnest face and Whitmore's darkening scowl. Finally, he stood. "I'll need to verify these claims," he announced. "Both of them. Wait here." The next hours dragged like days. Martha Joe perched on a hard wooden chair while Anders sent the telegrams and studied documents. Whitmore paced like a caged cat, occasionally shooting her venomous looks. The office grew stuffier as afternoon sun baked the windows. Finally, a telegraph operator hurried in with responses. Anders read them slowly, his expression giving nothing away. The silence stretched until Martha Joe thought she might scream. "Well," Anders said at last, "Reverend Colby's account matches yours exactly, Mrs. Boone. Judge Tanner confirms the ceremony's legitimacy as well." He picked up Silas's original documents. "These appear to be in order, filed properly, witnessed correctly." Whitmore slapped the desk. "Now see here." "No, sir, you see here," Anders cut in, his spine straightening. "These are legal documents, properly registered. The lady's claim stands." He pulled out a heavy seal, pressing it firmly to the papers. "I'll have these delivered to Judge Tanner myself. He'll want to review them, given recent events." Martha Joe's knees went weak with relief. She gripped the chair to stay upright as Whitmore stormed out, slamming the door behind him. "Thank you," she whispered. Anders nodded curtly. "There's a lodging house behind the post. Basic, but clean. I suggest you stay there tonight. These roads aren't safe after dark." The sun was setting as Martha Joe made her way to the small lodging house. The proprietor's wife showed her to a narrow cot in a sparse room. Martha Joe sank onto the thin mattress, still clutching her satchel. She thought of Silas, lying wounded in their cabin so many miles away. "Please, Lord," she prayed softly, "keep him safe until I return." Exhaustion washed over her in waves. She curled around the satchel like it was a lifeline, protecting the papers that might save their future. Sleep came in fits and starts, filled with uneasy dreams of burning barns and shadowy riders. But beneath the fear lay a thin thread of hope. They had won this round. Tomorrow she would begin the long ride home. Dawn painted the agency buildings in pale gold as Martha Joe mounted her mare. The satchel with their precious documents was secured tightly to her saddle. She patted the horse's neck, drawing comfort from its steady warmth. "Home now, girl," she whispered. "Silas needs us." The morning air held a bite that promised rain. Dark clouds massed over the distant mountains, their peaks already shrouded in grey. Martha Joe urged her horse north along the rutted road, keeping a wary eye on her surroundings. Every cracking twig made her start. By mid-morning, the clouds had spread across half the sky. The mare's hooves kicked up dust from the dry road. Martha Joe's thoughts kept returning to Silas, wondering if his fever had broken, if Henry had managed to tend him properly. She was so lost in worry that she almost missed the movement ahead. 4 ranch hands lounged across the road, their horses ground-tied nearby. They straightened as she approached, spreading out to block her path. Martha Joe's heart leaped into her throat as she recognized one of them. He'd been among the men watching their cabin days before. "Well now, Mrs. Boone," the tallest one called out, his voice thick with mock politeness. "Quite a ride for a lady. Why don't you let us escort you back to town?" Martha Joe reined her horse to a stop, keeping several yards between them. "I'm headed home to my husband. Railroad's offering good money to make sure you don't reach that cabin." Another man said, "Nothing personal, ma'am. Just business." Her hands trembled as she reached for Silas's pistol, tucked into her saddlebag. The weight of it felt strange and dangerous. "I won't be going to town," she said, forcing steel into her voice. Before they could move, she drew the pistol and fired straight up into the air. The shot cracked like thunder. Her mare danced beneath her, but Martha Joe held firm. She leveled the pistol toward the men, though her heart hammered so hard she could barely breathe. "Next shot won't go up," she warned, thanking God her voice didn't shake. The ranch hands exchanged uneasy glances. None of them had drawn their own weapons. "Now, miss," the tall one started, but Martha Joe cut him off. "It's Mrs. Boone," she corrected sharply, "and I'm riding through. Anyone who tries to stop me answers to this pistol and to my husband when he learns of it." Something in her tone, desperation mixed with raw determination, made them pause. After a long moment, they stepped back, leading their horses off the road. "Ain't worth dying over railroad money," one muttered as Martha Joe rode past, the pistol still trained steady. She kept the weapon ready until she was well beyond their sight. Only then did she let out a shuddering breath, her hands shaking so badly she had to return the pistol to its holster. The rest of the afternoon passed in tense vigilance. The clouds continued gathering, bringing an early twilight. Just as worry started to gnaw at her again, a familiar figure emerged from the trees ahead. "Henry!" Relief flooded through her as the Ute scout rode up alongside. "You succeeded?" he asked simply. Martha Joe nodded, patting her satchel. "The papers are sealed and recognized, but there are men watching the main road. Then we take other paths." Henry gestured toward a narrow trail leading into the trees. "I know ways they won't follow." They rode side by side as Henry led them through hidden valleys and along creek beds. The clouds finally opened, releasing a gentle rain that masked their passage. As darkness fell, Henry found them a sheltered camp beneath wide pine boughs. Soon a small fire crackled, driving back the damp chill. Martha Joe shared her remaining bread, while Henry provided strips of dried meat. They sat in comfortable silence until Henry spoke softly. "My brother would have liked you," he said, staring into the flames. "He believed peace was possible between our peoples, even after settlers poisoned the creek that watered our horses, even after their cattle trampled our cornfields." He looked up, pain etching his features. "They shot him when he tried to talk rather than fight." Martha Joe's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Many would say I am foolish to trust any settler now." Henry continued, "But I see how you and your husband treat the land, how you listen, how you share water and respect boundaries." He met her gaze across the fire. "Perhaps my brother was right. Perhaps peace is still possible." "I promise you," Martha Joe said fervently. "Our home will always honor your people's rights. The water belongs to all of us." Henry nodded slowly. "I believe you." They talked long into the night, sharing stories of loss and hope. Martha Joe spoke of her own struggles, of finding unexpected strength through Silas's faith in her. When they finally slept, it was with deeper understanding between them. Dawn broke clear and cold. They broke camp quickly, eager to reach the valley. Henry led them through one final shortcut as the sun climbed higher. Finally, they crested a familiar ridge. Martha Joe's heart caught in her throat as their cabin came into view through wisps of morning mist. Smoke rose promisingly from the chimney. But had Silas survived the fever? Had the railroad men returned? Hope and dread warred in her chest as they started down the trail toward home. Martha Jo and Henry urged their horses down the final slope toward the cabin. Morning mist curled around the cottonwoods as smoke rose steadily from the chimney, a promising sign. Her heart pounded against her ribs as they drew closer. The barn's blackened skeleton stood as a stark reminder of all they had endured. Dismounting quickly, Martha Jo rushed to the cabin door, her legs trembling beneath her. Inside, she found Silas propped up on his bedroll, pale but alert. His blue eyes brightened at the sight of her. "Martha," he whispered, voice hoarse but steady. She fell to her knees beside him, tears streaming down her face as she clasped his hand. His skin was cooler now. The terrible fever had broken. "I was so afraid," she choked out between sobs. "So afraid I'd lose you." Silas squeezed her hand weakly. "Takes more than a bullet to keep me from our home." He paused, studying her face. "Did you secure the papers?" Martha Jo nodded, wiping her eyes. "They're sealed and recognized. The clerk is sending them to Judge Tanner himself." Henry appeared in the doorway, carrying a leather pouch. "My mother prepared medicine," he said, kneeling beside them. "Herbs to fight fever and infection." He mixed the dried plants with hot water, creating a strong-smelling tea. Silas drank it without complaint, though the bitter taste made him grimace. Over the next few days, his strength slowly returned. Martha Jo rarely left his side, tending his wound and helping him sip the healing brew Henry brought each morning. On the fourth day, hoofbeats approached from the south. Martha Jo peered anxiously through the window, then straightened in surprise. "It's Judge Tanner," she announced, "and half the town with him." Indeed, a whole procession of riders filled their yard. Judge Tanner dismounted first, his official papers clutched in one hand. Reverend Colby rode beside him, along with several townsfolk Martha Jo recognized from their forced wedding day. She helped Silas to his feet, supporting him as they stepped onto the porch. Henry stood quietly to one side, watching. Judge Tanner cleared his throat, looking somewhat abashed. "Mrs. Boone," he began formally, "I've reviewed all documents concerning your marriage and land claim. The court finds that despite its unusual circumstances, your union with Silas Boone is legal and binding." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "Furthermore, the land grant naming you as rightful owner is upheld. The railroad's claims are dismissed." Martha Jo felt Silas's arm tighten around her shoulders. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. "I've ordered all railroad agents to withdraw from the valley immediately," the judge continued. "Any further interference with your property will be met with the full force of the law." He shifted uncomfortably. "I also owe you both an apology for my part in that public spectacle. I should have shown more backbone." Reverend Colby stepped forward then, his kind face solemn. "We all owe apologies," he said, gesturing to the gathered townsfolk. "We stood by and watched cruelty when we should have shown Christian charity." Several people nodded, looking ashamed. Tom Webster, the mercantile owner, spoke up. "We brought lumber for a new barn," he said gruffly. "Least we could do." Martha Jo saw wagons behind the riders, loaded with fresh-cut planks and beams. Her vision blurred with tears again, but this time from gratitude. Sarah Miller, who had once whispered cruel things about Martha Jo's size, held out a cloth sack. "Seed for your spring garden," she said softly, "and some starter hens from my own coop." One by one, neighbors stepped forward with offerings, tools, food, promises of help. Even those who had jeered the loudest now seemed eager to make amends. Reverend Colby raised his hands for prayer. "Lord," his voice carried across the yard, "we thank you for showing us, through Martha Jo and Silas, what true courage and forgiveness look like. Their union has become a blessing to this valley, bringing together those who were divided. Help us build not just a new barn, but a new spirit of community." "Amen," came the response, from settlers and youth alike. The work began immediately. Men raised posts while women organized a cooking area. Henry's family arrived with more of their people, skilled hands joining in the effort. The sound of hammers rang through the valley as the barn's new framework took shape. Martha Jo moved between groups, directing where things should go, accepting embraces from women who had once shunned her. She saw Sarah Miller and Henry's wife exchanging recipes, while their children played together near the creek. As evening approached, lanterns were lit around the worksite. The rich smell of stew bubbled from iron pots. Martha Jo had never seen anything so beautiful as these former enemies working side by side, sharing food and stories beneath the golden light. She found Silas sitting on the porch, watching it all with wonder. Though still weak, color had returned to his face. She settled beside him, feeling his warm strength against her shoulder. "I never thought I'd see such a sight," he murmured, gesturing to the gathered families. "You did this, Martha Jo. Your courage changed everything." She blushed, remembering her desperate ride, the confrontation with the ranch hands, the long nights of worry. "I just couldn't bear to lose our home," she said quietly. "Or you." Silas turned to face her, his eyes intense despite his weakness. "When they forced me to marry you, I thought Providence had cursed me," he admitted. "Instead, it gave me the greatest blessing of my life. You're the anchor that holds this place together, that holds me together." Martha Jo's heart swelled as she looked out over their land. The new barn rose strong and true. Laughter mixed with hymns around the cooking fires. Henry's people and the settlers shared stories as easily as they shared bread. She had finally found what she had always longed for, not just a home, but a place where she truly belonged. Where her size didn't matter, where her heart's strength shone brighter than any physical trait. She was no longer the shamed girl from San Juan Crossing. She was Martha Jo Boone, and she had helped build something beautiful. Weeks passed, and spring painted the valley in vibrant greens. The new barn stood tall and proud against the blue sky, its fresh-cut timber gleaming in the morning light. Where ashes had once marked destruction, now life flourished abundantly. By the creek, children's laughter rang out clear and sweet. Martha Jo watched from the meadow as settler kids played stick games with Ute youngsters, their previous divisions forgotten in the joy of play. The water sparkled as it tumbled over rocks, marking the boundary that had once divided them but now brought them together. Silas walked beside her, his bandaged arm still held close to his chest, but healing well. His large hand entwined with hers as they strolled through the tall grass. The touch still made her heart flutter, even after all they'd shared. In town, whispers had transformed. No longer did folks mock her size or spread cruel gossip. Instead, they spoke of her bravery, of how she'd faced down armed men to save her land. "That Martha Jo Boone," they'd say with respect. "She's got more courage than most men I know." When Sunday arrived, the community gathered in the new barn's loft. Sunlight streamed through the fresh-cut boards as Reverend Colby led them in prayers of thanksgiving. The space was filled with both settlers and Ute families, their voices joining together in hymns of praise. Near the service's end, Silas rose slowly to his feet. His voice trembled with emotion as he addressed the gathered congregation. "Folks here remember how this marriage started," he said, looking directly at Martha Jo. "They said I was forced to marry her. Truth is, I was forced into grace, and I'll never let it go." Tears welled in Martha Jo's eyes as the crowd erupted in fervent amends. Her heart felt ready to burst with joy and gratitude for how far they'd come from that shameful day on the street. As evening approached, she and Silas sat together on their porch, listening to the creek's steady song. The sunset painted the western sky in brilliant golds and pinks. Martha Jo leaned against her husband's strong shoulder, feeling the peace they'd fought so hard to achieve. The horizon glowed with promise, speaking of a future filled with dignity, deepening faith, and the precious gift of shared peace. Thanks for being here. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, a truth, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another moment that just might speak to your soul.